June 4, 1942, 4:30 in the morning, 250 miles northwest of Midway Island, in a stretch of the Pacific Ocean that no map had ever given a name to, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi and watched his pilots disappear into the dark. 108 aircraft were lifting off the flight decks of 4 carriers, 36 dive bombers, 36 level bombers, 36 Zero fighters. The roar of their engines could be felt through the steel plating of the bridge. The aircraft climbed into a sky that was just beginning to turn grey at the edges, and one by one their lights vanished into the low cloud cover. The man commanding them, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, had never led a strike of this size before. But Nagumo was not worried about Tomonaga. He was not worried about Midway. He was not worried about anything. For 6 months, every operation he had commanded had ended in the same way. Victory. Total, efficient, overwhelming victory. Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, the Indian Ocean. His carriers had crossed more ocean than any naval force in history and had not lost a single ship. The enemy had not once been able to touch him. Nagumo watched the last aircraft lift off and turned back to the business of the bridge. Below him, on the brightly lit hangar decks, ordnance crews were already preparing the next wave. Torpedoes were being wheeled on hand trucks across the deck and jacked up under the bellies of waiting bombers. Fuel lines were live. Everything was running on the schedule that the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 years perfecting. If all went according to plan, by the end of the day Midway would be softened for invasion, and any American ships foolish enough to come within range would be at the bottom of the ocean. There was no reason to think otherwise. Every calculation said so. Every precedent confirmed it. 12 hours later, Nagumo would be sitting in a borrowed cabin aboard the cruiser Nagara, staring at nothing, while all 4 of his aircraft carriers burned and sank behind him. 3,057 of his men would be dead. Nearly 250 aircraft, everything the 4 carriers had embarked, would be gone. The instrument that Japan had spent 20 years building, the most powerful carrier striking force the world had ever seen, would cease to exist in a single afternoon. And the man who had watched his pilots fly into the dawn that morning would spend the rest of the war trying to understand what had gone wrong, until he put a pistol to his temple on the island of Saipan 2 years later and stopped trying. This is the story of how the sky turned against him, not because of luck, not because of a single mistake, but because of something built into the bones of 2 navies that neither side fully understood until it was too late. To understand what happened above those 4 carriers on the morning of June 4, 1942, we cannot start at Midway. We have to go back to the place where Japan first learned to make the sea obey it. We have to go back to a strait between 2 islands in 1905, and to the man who taught the Imperial Japanese Navy that the only way to win a war was to destroy the enemy fleet in a single overwhelming blow before the enemy knew the fight had started. The man's name was Admiral Togo Heihachiro, and his victory at the Battle of Tsushima in May of 1905 was so total, so annihilating, that it became less a battle in Japanese military memory and more a religious event. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed 18,000 miles to fight. Togo destroyed it in an afternoon. Of the 38 Russian warships that entered the strait, only 3 reached their destination. All 11 Russian battleships were lost, 7 sunk, and 4 captured. Over 4,300 Russian sailors were killed. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats and 117 men. It was the most lopsided naval victory since Trafalgar, and it taught the Imperial Japanese Navy a lesson that would shape everything that followed for the next 40 years. The lesson was this: concentration of force and decisive battle. Find the enemy fleet, bring every ship you have to bear on it, and annihilate it in one engagement. Do not divide. Do not hesitate. Do not give the enemy time to recover. Strike first. Strike hard. End the war before it begins. That philosophy, born at Tsushima, became the spiritual core of Japanese naval doctrine. It shaped how Japan built its fleet, how it trained its officers, and eventually how it designed its carrier operations. When aircraft carriers emerged as the dominant weapon of naval warfare in the 1930s, Japan adapted the Tsushima doctrine to the new reality. Instead of concentrating battleships, Japan would concentrate carriers. Instead of a decisive gun battle, there would be a decisive airstrike. The principle was the same. Mass everything. Hit first. Annihilate. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet, was the weapon built to deliver that blow. 6 fleet carriers operating as a single concentrated force. No other navy in the world had anything like it. The Americans spread their carriers across the ocean in separate task forces. The British used theirs to support convoys. The Japanese put all of their best carriers together and trained them to launch coordinated strikes from all 6 flight decks simultaneously. The effect was a hammer that could deliver over 300 aircraft against a single point in a single wave. Nothing afloat could survive it. And the man they chose to swing that hammer was Chuichi Nagumo, a torpedo specialist, a surface warfare expert, a man who had spent his career studying how to fight with destroyers and cruisers, not aircraft. His own colleagues knew the appointment was wrong. According to the historian Gordon Prange, Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, who knew Nagumo personally, said that he was wholly unfitted by background, training, experience, and interest for a major role in naval aviation. He was, Tsukahara reportedly said, a specialist of torpedo and surface maneuvers who did not have any idea of the capability and potential of naval aviation. But in the Imperial Japanese Navy, seniority was seniority. Nagumo had the rank. He got the command. And for 6 extraordinary months, it did not matter. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Nagumo's carriers launched 183 aircraft in the first wave and 171 in the second. In less than 2 hours, the strike force sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground, and killed 2,403 Americans. Japan lost 29 aircraft. It was Tsushima from the sky. It was everything the Doctrine promised. After the attack, Fuchida later claimed that he had urged Nagumo to launch a third wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks and repair facilities. Nagumo declined. He had achieved his objective. He did not want to risk his carriers by lingering. Modern historians, including Jonathan Parshall and H.P. Wilmot, regard Fuchida's account of this exchange as a likely post-war embellishment, and Commander Minoru Genda, who was present, flatly denied it ever took place. What is not disputed is that Nagumo chose caution over aggression, and that pattern would define him at Midway. Darwin, Australia. February 19, 1942. Nagumo's carriers launched 188 aircraft against the port. They sank 8 ships, destroyed most of the airfield, and killed at least 236 people. The raid was larger than the first wave at Pearl Harbor. Opposition was negligible. The Indian Ocean, April 1942. The Kido Butai sailed into the Bay of Bengal and struck the British naval base at Colombo, then Trincomalee. They sank the British carrier Hermes, the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and the destroyer Vampire. The Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet withdrew westward rather than engage. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers after every sortie with the same report: the enemy cannot touch us. And they were right. For 6 months, nobody could. The effect of this unbroken string of victories on the Japanese command was subtle and corrosive. Contemporaries had a term for it. They called it victory disease. Officers who had never been seriously challenged began to assume they would never be seriously challenged. Planning grew overconfident. Contingencies went unexamined. The possibility that the enemy might do something unexpected was not studied, because the enemy had never done anything unexpected. This is the part you need to hold on to, because it is the hinge on which the rest of the story turns. The Kido Butai, by the spring of 1942, was not just undefeated, it was untested. It had never fought an opponent who could hit back. Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack on a Sunday morning. Darwin was a strike against a lightly defended port. The Indian Ocean raids were attacks on isolated ships that were operating alone. None of these engagements had required the Japanese carriers to do the one thing that would prove fatal at Midway. None of them had required the carriers to absorb an attack while simultaneously preparing to launch one. The confidence aboard those 4 carriers on the morning of June 4 was real. The pilots believed they were the best in the world, and in terms of individual skill, they probably were. The deck crews believed their procedures were flawless because so far they had been. The officers believed the enemy would behave the way the enemy had always behaved, which was to scatter, to retreat, and to die. Nobody on those ships was thinking about what would happen if an American pilot, low on fuel and lost over open ocean, looked at his fuel gauge and the empty horizon and made a decision that was not in any manual. Nobody was thinking about what would happen if the Americans did something that was not supposed to be possible. That brings us to the other side of the ocean, and to the months before Midway, when the United States Navy was trying to learn how to fight a carrier war while already fighting one. The American carrier force in the spring of 1942 was not impressive by any measure the Japanese would have recognized. It was small. After Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet had 4 operational carriers. By the time of Midway, one of those, the Lexington, had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. The Coral Sea had been the first carrier battle in history in which the opposing ships never saw each other. All the fighting was done by aircraft. The Americans sank the light carrier Shoho and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku, but they lost the Lexington, and the Yorktown took a bomb through her flight deck that should have put her out of action for months. Nimitz needed the Yorktown at Midway. When she limped into Pearl Harbor trailing an oil slick, the Navy Yard estimated 90 days for repairs. Nimitz gave them 3. 1,400 workmen swarmed over the ship around the clock. They did not fully repair her. They made her functional. She sailed for Midway with welding crews still aboard, work still unfinished, carrying aircraft from 3 different squadrons hastily assembled to replace her losses from the Coral Sea. She was a patched-together ship, carrying a patched-together air group into a battle against 4 fleet carriers, whose air crews had been training together for over a year. Enterprise and Hornet, the 2 undamaged carriers, formed Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a surface warfare officer, not an aviator. He had been given command at the last minute because Vice Admiral William Halsey, the original task force commander, had been hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Halsey, from his hospital bed, recommended Spruance as his replacement. It was an unusual choice. Spruance had never commanded carriers in combat. But Halsey trusted him, and Nimitz trusted Halsey. The pilots aboard those carriers were a mixed group. Some were veterans of the early raids on the Marshall Islands and Wake. Some were fresh from flight school. Almost none of them had ever made a combat torpedo run against a defended target. Their torpedo bomber, the Douglas TBD Devastator, was obsolete. It was slow, poorly armed, and required the pilot to fly straight and level at low altitude for an agonizingly long approach run. The torpedo it carried, the Mark 13, was unreliable. It often failed to detonate. It often ran off course. In testing, the weapon had a failure rate that would have been grounds for cancelling any peacetime procurement program. This was the force that was about to fight the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled. The only advantage the Americans had was one the Japanese did not know about, and it was decisive. In a basement office at Pearl Harbor, a team of Navy cryptanalysts, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25B. They could not read every message, but they could read enough. In the weeks before Midway, Rochefort's team identified the target, which the Japanese referred to in code as AF. To confirm that AF was Midway, Rochefort arranged for the base at Midway to send a fake, uncoded message reporting a broken water distillation plant. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation was exact. Nimitz knew where, he knew when, he knew the approximate composition of the Japanese force, and he set a trap. But knowing the enemy is coming and being able to stop him are not the same thing. What happened next depended entirely on the men in the cockpits, and the first of those men to find the Japanese fleet were the ones who would not come back. Every like on this video keeps stories like theirs visible for one more person who needs to hear them. That is not a small thing. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron was 41 years old. He was born in Fort Pierre, South Dakota, a small town on the Missouri River. He was of Sioux descent on his mother's side. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924 and completed flight training in 1927. By the morning of the battle, he had been flying for 15 years. He commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the carrier Hornet. He was, by the accounts of the men who served under him, intensely demanding, personally fearless, and convinced that his squadron, despite its obsolete aircraft, could fight as well as any in the fleet. When new pilots arrived at the squadron, Waldron, according to the author Robert Mrazek, told his executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Larson, "We are getting fresh, green kids. We have got to make fighting men out of them, and we may not have much time." His pilots were young. Most of them had never seen combat. Several had fewer than 100 hours in torpedo bombers. The planes they were flying, the TBD Devastators, were the aircraft Waldron had been dreading. His squadron had been scheduled to receive the new TBF Avengers, faster, better armed, with enclosed turrets and self-sealing fuel tanks. But the Hornet had sailed from Pearl Harbor before the new planes arrived. The Avengers were shipped separately to Midway, where 6 of them, under a detachment led by Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling, would fly their own attack against the Japanese fleet. 5 of those 6 Avengers were shot down. Waldron was going into battle with the worst torpedo bomber in the fleet, and he knew it. The night before the battle, Waldron sat down and wrote a letter to his wife Adelaide. He also prepared a mimeographed message for his pilots. In it he wrote, "My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we do not, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give them hell." Read that again. He was telling 30 men, most of them in their early 20s, that they might all die tomorrow, and that the last one alive was expected to keep attacking. On the morning of June 4, the Hornet launched its air group. The air group commander, Commander Stanhope Ring, led the formation on a heading that Waldron believed was wrong. Waldron had argued for a different course. He had studied the charts. He had thought about where a Japanese admiral would be, and he believed the fleet was to the southwest of Ring's heading. When the formation was airborne, Waldron made a decision. He broke formation. He took his 15 Devastators and turned southwest, alone, without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, following nothing but his own judgment about where the enemy would be. He was right. At approximately 9:20 in the morning, Waldron's squadron sighted the Japanese carriers. He radioed the position and asked for help. Nobody answered. The other squadrons had turned south and were out of range. Waldron was alone with 15 slow torpedo planes against the most heavily defended fleet on Earth. He attacked anyway. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, roughly 30 Zero fighters, fell on Torpedo Squadron 8 like a wall. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything the Devastators could defend against. One by one, the torpedo planes were shot down. Waldron's own plane was hit, the left fuel tank ruptured and burning. He was last seen trying to stand up in his cockpit as his aircraft plunged toward the water. In approximately 15 minutes, all 15 Devastators were destroyed. 29 of the 30 aircrew were dead. The sole survivor was Ensign George Henry Gay, 25 years old, from Waco, Texas. Gay pressed his attack through fire from as many as 5 Zeros simultaneously. His rear gunner, radioman Robert Huntington, was killed during the approach. Gay dropped his torpedo at roughly 800 yards, flew directly over the carrier, and was shot down. He escaped the sinking aircraft with wounds to his left hand and leg. He spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean. He hid under a black seat cushion to avoid being spotted by Japanese ships passing nearby, and from that position, alone in the water, he watched the rest of the battle unfold. He watched the carriers burn. But Torpedo Squadron 8 was not alone in its sacrifice. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, 14 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, attacked next. Lindsay had been injured in a deck crash just days earlier and flew despite his condition. 10 of his 14 planes were shot down. Lindsay was killed. No torpedoes hit. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, 12 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. They had a small fighter escort, 6 Wildcats led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who was that day testing for the first time in combat a new defensive tactic he had invented called the thatch weave. But 6 fighters could not protect 12 torpedo bombers against the swarm of Zeros. 10 of 12 devastators were shot down. Massey was killed. Again, no torpedoes hit. In less than an hour, 41 torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese fleet. 35 were shot down. All 3 squadron commanders were dead. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. By every measure the Japanese understood, the attack had been a failure. The carriers were unharmed. The American torpedo force had been annihilated. The officers on Nagumo's bridge had reason to believe the worst was over. They were wrong, because those torpedo pilots, in dying, had done something that no one on either side fully understood in the moment. They had pulled every Zero in the combat air patrol down to sea level. The fighters had chased the torpedo planes to the water and stayed there, refueling, rearming, scattered across a wide area below 1,000 feet. There was, for a brief window of time, almost nothing above 20,000 feet over the Japanese fleet. The sky above the carriers was open, and approaching from the southwest, almost out of fuel, were the men who were about to change the war. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey was the air group commander of the Enterprise. He had been born in Buffalo, New York, in 1902, and had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926. He had launched that morning with 34 Dauntless dive bombers. He was not originally a dive bomber pilot. He had been a fighter pilot before being promoted to Air Group Command, and there is still debate among historians about whether that background affected the decisions he made over the target. But the decision he made before reaching the target is beyond debate. It changed everything. McCluskey flew to the expected interception point and found empty ocean. The Japanese fleet was not where it was supposed to be. Nagumo had turned his carriers to the northeast after receiving the scout report about American ships, and that turn had moved the fleet out of the position where the Americans expected to find it. McCluskey was critically low on fuel. His pilots were critically low on fuel. Several had already dropped out of formation with engine trouble. Standard procedure would have been to turn back. Some of his pilots later said they expected the order to come at any moment. It did not come. McCluskey kept flying. He reasoned that the Japanese could not be to the south, because Midway-based patrol planes would have spotted them. They must have turned north. He expanded his search to the northwest, and at approximately 9:55 in the morning, he spotted a white wake on the surface of the ocean below him. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, racing at full speed to rejoin the fleet. She had fallen behind because she had been depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like an arrow, and it led him straight to the Kido Butai. He arrived over the fleet at almost the same moment that Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, arrived from a different direction. Neither group knew the other was coming. The coincidence was not planned. It was the result of 2 separate commanders, operating independently, making independent decisions that happened to converge over the same patch of ocean at the same time. What happened in the next few minutes is among the most consequential events in the history of naval warfare. But before we go into what the dive bombers did, we need to understand what they found when they looked down, because the state of the Japanese carriers at that moment, at roughly 10:22 in the morning, is the key to understanding everything that went wrong for Nagumo, and the popular version of what they found is wrong. For decades, the accepted story of Midway has been built on an account written by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Japanese aviator who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fuchida was aboard Akagi during the battle, grounded by an appendectomy. In 1955, he published a book that became the standard Japanese source on Midway. In it, he wrote that the American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment, with all their strike aircraft fully armed and fueled on the flight decks, engines warming, seconds from launching. He described it as 5 fatal minutes, 5 minutes of delay that cost Japan the war. It is a powerful image. It is also, according to modern scholarship, substantially false. The historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, working from Japanese primary sources, including the official war history, known as the Senshi Sosho, demonstrated in their 2005 book, Shattered Sword, that the Japanese strike aircraft were not on the flight decks at the time of the attack. They were in the hangars. The flight decks were occupied primarily by combat air patrol fighters being cycled for refueling. Nagumo's own estimate, recorded in Japanese records, was that his strike force would not be ready to launch until 1100 at the earliest. He was nowhere near ready. The reason he was not ready is the part of the story that actually matters. It goes back to 7 o'clock that morning. Tomonaga's strike had hit Midway but had not destroyed the airfield. At approximately 700, Tomonaga radioed back to Akagi with a message that would set the catastrophe in motion. He said there is need for a second attack. Nagumo faced a decision. He had held back a reserve strike force on his carriers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. Yamamoto's orders had been explicit: keep the reserve armed for anti-ship operations. But no American ships had been detected, and Midway's defenses were still intact. The island needed to be neutralized for the invasion to proceed. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed. Take off the torpedoes, put on land attack bombs, begin preparing for a second strike against Midway. The order went to the hangar decks of all 4 carriers. Ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes from the bombers and replacing them with bombs. Torpedoes were heavy, 17 feet long, and had to be lowered on jacks, wheeled across crowded hangar decks on handcarts, and stored. Bombs had to be brought up from the magazines and attached. The work was physical, slow, and could not be rushed. While the rearming was underway, the Kido Butai was under attack from Midway-based aircraft. 6 brand-new TBF Avengers, a detachment from Torpedo Squadron 8 that had arrived at Midway before the Hornet sailed, attacked first. 5 were shot down. 4 Army B-26 Marauders, hastily modified to carry torpedoes, came in next at barely 200 feet. No torpedoes hit. But one of the B-26s, piloted by First Lieutenant James Murray, flew the entire length of the Akagi at mast height after dropping its torpedo, strafing the flight deck and killing 2 crew members. Another B-26, badly damaged and possibly out of control, flew directly at Akagi's bridge in what the Japanese believed was a deliberate suicide attempt. It missed Nagumo and his staff by a matter of feet before crashing into the ocean. The near miss shook Nagumo visibly. Japanese officers on the bridge reported afterward that the American willingness to press attacks to the point of self-destruction was something they had not anticipated and had not been prepared for. Then came 16 Marine Dauntless dive bombers under Major Lofton Henderson, followed by 11 obsolete Vindicator dive bombers, followed by high-altitude B-17 bombers. Henderson was killed leading his squadron in. The airfield at Guadalcanal would later be named Henderson Field in his honor. None of the Midway-based attacks scored a hit on any Japanese ship, but they kept the carriers maneuvering, kept the combat air patrol cycling, and consumed the one resource Nagumo could not replace: time. And then, at approximately 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. The Tone's No. 4 scout had launched late that morning, roughly 30 minutes behind schedule, reportedly because of a catapult malfunction, though the exact cause has never been established. That delay meant the scout was searching its sector later than planned. The report was vague. It said ships. It did not say what kind. Nagumo froze. If those ships included a carrier, he needed his reserve armed with torpedoes, not bombs. But his reserve was in the middle of being rearmed with bombs. He asked for clarification. At 7:45, a second message arrived. The enemy force appeared to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief passed visibly across Nagumo's face. Cruisers and destroyers were not a mortal threat to his carriers. But at 8:20, the scout sent a third message, and this one changed everything. The enemy force appeared to include what looked like an aircraft carrier. Now Nagumo was in an impossible position. His reserve aircraft were half rearmed. Some had bombs, some had torpedoes, some had neither. The first strike wave from Midway was returning and needed to land. You cannot launch and recover aircraft at the same time on the same flight deck. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from the Hiryu, signaled Nagumo with a recommendation. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi wanted to send whatever was ready, right now, even without fighter escort, even without full coordination, hit the American carrier before it could hit them. Nagumo declined. He wanted to do it the right way. He wanted a full, coordinated strike, all 4 carriers launching simultaneously, fighters and bombers together, the way the Doctrine prescribed, the way it had been done at Pearl Harbor and Darwin and Ceylon. He decided to recover the returning Midway strike first, then prepare a properly organized attack. It was the decision the Doctrine demanded. It was the decision Tsushima had taught. Concentrate your force. Do not divide. Launch everything at once for maximum effect. And it was the decision that killed the Kido Butai, because the Doctrine assumed you would have time. It assumed the enemy would wait for you, and the Americans at that moment were not waiting. At 10:22, the first Dauntless Dove, McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise split between 2 targets. In the confusion, nearly all of them, including McCluskey himself, dove on the carrier Kaga, but Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, the commander of Bombing Squadron 6, saw what was happening. He saw 31 aircraft pouring down on a single carrier when there were 2 carriers below him. In the middle of his own dive, Best pulled out, signaled to his 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber, and redirected to the second carrier, the carrier with its island structure on the port side instead of the starboard. Only 2 carriers in the world had ever been built that way, Akagi and Hiryu, and Best knew which one he was looking at. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. 3 aircraft dove on Akagi. 3. Against the flagship of the most powerful carrier fleet on Earth. Kroger's bomb missed, hitting the water near the bridge. Weber's bomb exploded in the water just off the stern, a near miss whose blast wave jammed the rudder. Best's bomb, a 1,000-pound general-purpose weapon, was the only one to strike the ship. It hit the flight deck amidships and punched through into the upper hangar. Best later said he aimed for the large red circle painted on the deck near the amidships aircraft elevator. He knew his target. He had studied Japanese ship silhouettes and recognized Akagi by her distinctive portside island, a feature shared only with Hiryu among all the carriers ever built. The hangar was full of aircraft. The aircraft were full of fuel, loose ordnance, the torpedoes and bombs that had been removed during the rearming chaos and had not been returned to the magazines because the ordnance elevators were too slow and the handcarts too few, was stacked around them on the hangar deck. The ordnance had been set aside in the urgency of the moment, waiting to be struck below. It never was. The explosion in the hangar set off a chain of secondary detonations that turned Akagi into a furnace. Fuel lines, which ran through the ship in an unarmored network, carried fire from compartment to compartment. The wooden flight deck, the timber internal supports, the cotton pipe insulation, everything burned. Nagumo stood near the compass on the bridge as smoke poured up around him. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, urged him to transfer his flag to another ship. Nagumo did not respond. He stood there, staring, and reportedly muttered, "It is not time yet." Kusaka finally persuaded him to evacuate. They climbed down from the burning bridge by rope. The judo-trained Nagumo landed lightly on the deck below. Kusaka sprained both ankles. At almost the same moment, Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs. Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher of Scouting Squadron 6 placed the first bomb onto Kaga's flight deck. Gallagher had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He had watched the Arizona burn. He later said he was thinking of that morning as he pushed over into his dive. Kaga burned from bow to stern. 811 of her crew would die, the highest casualties of any ship in the battle. And while Enterprise's bombers were destroying Akagi and Kaga, Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown was hitting Soryu. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. Captain Ryosaku Yamamoto refused to abandon ship. According to Japanese accounts, he was last seen standing on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem as the flames consumed his ship. 711 of his crew died with him. 3 carriers, mortally wounded, in approximately 5 minutes of diving. The time from the first bomb to the last was not much longer than it takes to read this paragraph aloud. The concentrated striking power that Japan had spent 20 years building, the weapon that had crippled the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean, was gone. If your father, or grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the Pacific during World War II, in any branch, on any ship, or any island, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit, where they served, what they remembered, those personal details, the ones that never made it into the official reports, are the real history, and they deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, survived the morning attack because she was operating several miles away from the other three. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, the same officer who had urged Nagumo to launch immediately, was the most aggressive carrier admiral in the Japanese Navy. He launched 2 strikes against the Yorktown that afternoon, hitting her with bombs and then torpedoes, eventually crippling her so badly that she was later sunk by a Japanese submarine. But that evening, Enterprise dive bombers found Hiryu. Lieutenant Gallagher led the attack again. Dick Best, despite coughing blood from a faulty oxygen canister that was slowly destroying his lungs, was among the pilots who dove, possibly scoring one of the hits that doomed her. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in total. She burned through the night. As Hiryu died, Yamaguchi gathered the roughly 800 men still aboard on the flight deck near the bridge. He led them in 3 banzai calls toward Tokyo. The national anthem was played. Then the order to abandon ship was given. Yamaguchi and Hiryu's captain, Tomio Kaku, remained behind. According to Japanese accounts, they shared naval biscuits and water as the crew climbed down into the boats. The 2 men, watching the moon rise over the burning deck, shared a final exchange. "Let us enjoy the beauty of the moon," Yamaguchi said to Kaku. They went down with the ship. Now here is the question this story has been building toward. Why? Why did the most experienced carrier force on Earth, commanded by officers who had not lost a battle in 6 months, crewed by pilots who were among the finest naval aviators alive, why did they lose to a force that was smaller, less experienced, flying inferior aircraft, and carrying torpedoes that did not work? The standard answers are rearming, reconnaissance, the late scout plane from the Tone, Nagumo's indecision. All of these are true, but they are symptoms. They are not the disease. The disease was something deeper, something structural, and something that lived in the difference between how the 2 navies made decisions when the plan stopped working. The Japanese Navy was built on the principle of the coordinated strike. Everything launched together, everything arrived together, maximum force at a single point. This required precise timing, careful preparation, and above all, it required control from the top. The Admiral decided when to launch. The Admiral decided what to arm the planes with. The Admiral decided the composition of the strike force. The pilots executed. The deck crews followed orders. The system was hierarchical, disciplined, and, when it worked, devastating. But the system had a fatal weakness. It could not adapt in real time. When the situation changed faster than the Admiral could process it, the system seized. Every decision had to flow upward, be evaluated, and then flow back down. Nagumo's dilemma that morning, the rearming, the reversal, the agonized waiting for scout reports, was not a failure of one man. It was a failure of a system that placed all decision-making authority in one man and then confronted him with a situation that was changing faster than any one man could think. The Americans, by contrast, were operating in what can only be described as organized chaos. Their launch that morning was a mess. The squadrons from different carriers could not coordinate. The air group from the Hornet flew the wrong direction entirely, and most of its dive bombers never found the enemy. The torpedo squadrons arrived piecemeal, without fighter cover, and were slaughtered. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the target at the same time by pure coincidence, not by planning. Nothing about the American attack looked, from the outside, like a coordinated operation. It looked like a disaster. And yet it worked. It worked because within that chaos, individual men were making individual decisions that turned out to be exactly right. Waldron broke formation and followed his instinct to find the fleet. McCluskey, almost out of fuel, refused to turn back and spotted a lone destroyer that led him to the target. Best, in the middle of a dive, saw that 30 aircraft were hitting the same carrier and improvised a target switch with 2 wingmen in real time. Leslie attacked from a completely different direction at almost the same moment, without any communication with McCluskey. None of this was planned. None of it was coordinated. And none of it would have been possible in the Japanese system, because the Japanese system did not trust the man in the cockpit to make those decisions. In the Japanese system, the pilot flew where he was told, attacked what he was told to attack, and returned. Initiative was not a virtue. Obedience was. The Japanese pilot was not expected to think about the tactical picture. That was the Admiral's job. The pilot was expected to execute the Admiral's plan with perfect precision, and when the Admiral's plan stopped matching reality, the pilot had no doctrine, no training, and no cultural permission to adapt. The Americans had no such constraint, not because their doctrine was better. Their doctrine was, on paper, at least as rigid as the Japanese. The difference was cultural. The young men in those cockpits had been raised in a country where figuring things out on your own was not a special skill. It was an expectation. McCluskey was a fighter pilot who had been given command of an air group. He had no training in dive bomber tactics. He figured it out. Best was a squadron commander who had to improvise a target change at terminal velocity. He figured it out. Waldron was a lieutenant commander who disagreed with his air group commander's heading, broke formation in defiance of orders, and turned out to be the only pilot from the Hornet who found the enemy that day. He figured it out, and he paid for it with his life. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogated hundreds of Japanese military officials about the battles they had fought. The transcripts of those interrogations are among the most revealing documents to come out of the Pacific War, because in them, Japanese officers said things they would never have said publicly. They spoke with a candor that their culture did not normally permit, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with what reads in the transcripts almost like bewilderment. Captain Susumu Kawaguchi, Hiryu's air officer, told his interrogators that dive bombing was the form of attack they feared most. "You cannot avoid it," he said, "but you can avoid torpedoes dropped at long range." This was a remarkable admission from a navy that had built its entire carrier doctrine around the torpedo strike. The weapon they feared most was not the weapon they had designed their defenses against. It was the one they had underestimated. The torpedo squadrons that morning had terrified the Japanese, not because they succeeded, but because they kept coming. 15 planes from Waldron's squadron flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and 0 fighters, and every single one pressed its attack until it was shot down. Japanese officers who witnessed it said afterward that the courage of those crews was something they had not expected and could not understand. One account described the Japanese watching the last Devastator, its fuselage streaming fire, still boring in toward a carrier, still trying to drop its torpedo. The image stayed with them. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding officer of the Akagi, stated in his post-war interrogation that his strike aircraft were being serviced inside the hangar when the bombs hit. He recalled roughly 40 aircraft below decks. The popular image of Japanese carriers with their decks packed and ready to launch was not what the surviving officers described. Aoki's account aligned with what American pilots like Dick Best reported seeing from the air, which was that the flight decks had primarily fighters on them, not bombers. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto, was also interrogated. The survey's summary of his account recorded that the defeat was blamed on the carrier force, which did not maintain sufficient caution and search of the area. That assessment, stripped of its diplomatic language, was an indictment of the entire system. The carriers had been so focused on attacking, so trained in the Tsushima doctrine of the overwhelming first strike, that they had not adequately defended themselves against the possibility that the enemy might strike first. The reconnaissance plan for Midway had relied on just 7 scout planes to cover an enormous ocean. The Americans, by contrast, had more than 30 patrol planes searching from Midway alone. There was a structural failure that went deeper than reconnaissance. The Japanese carriers themselves were built to attack, not to absorb punishment. Their fuel systems consisted of unprotected lines that ran through the ship like veins, carrying aviation gasoline from storage tanks to the hangar decks. When a bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar, the fuel lines became fuses. Fire spread not by contact but by system, following the fuel from compartment to compartment. The carrier's interiors were constructed with wooden floors, timber framing, and cotton pipe insulation, all of which burned. American carriers, by contrast, had begun incorporating damage control lessons learned from the Coral Sea. The Yorktown took hits from Hiryu's strikes that afternoon and survived for 2 more days before being finished off by a submarine. A Japanese carrier hit by the same ordnance was gone in hours. But the most revealing Japanese assessment came not from the interrogation rooms, but from the internal Japanese war history, the Senshi Sosho, compiled after the war. It stated that even if Nagumo had begun lifting his strike aircraft to the flight deck immediately after recovering his combat air patrol at 10:10, his carriers would not have been ready to launch for at least 40 more minutes. The strike could not have gotten airborne before 1100. The American dive bombers arrived at 10:22. The window had closed before Nagumo even knew it was open. This is the part that matters most. The Japanese lost at Midway not because Nagumo made the wrong decision. He was arguably making the right decision according to his doctrine. The doctrine said, coordinate. The doctrine said, mass your force. The doctrine said, do not launch a piecemeal attack. The problem was that the doctrine was designed for a world in which you had time, and on the morning of June 4, time was the one thing Nagumo did not have. The Americans won at Midway not because their plan worked. Their plan fell apart almost immediately. They won because their individual pilots, operating in the wreckage of a failed plan, made independent decisions that happened to produce, through no centralized coordination, a result that no plan could have predicted. 41 torpedo bombers drew the fighters down. 1 air group commander followed a destroyer to the fleet. 1 squadron commander switched targets in mid-air. 1 strike group from a different carrier arrived from a different direction at the same moment by accident. The cumulative effect was a simultaneous strike from multiple vectors that overwhelmed the Japanese defenses at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. It looked like genius. It was actually something stranger. It was the emergent behavior of a system that trusted its lowest-level operators to think. So here is the answer to why the sky turned against the Admiral who was saluting his pilots at dawn. The sky turned because the men flying toward him were products of a system, or rather the absence of a system, that his own system could not predict. His navy had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the coordinated strike. Their navy had stumbled, almost by accident, into the art of the uncoordinated strike that still somehow coordinated itself. His pilots waited for the plan. Their pilots became the plan. His doctrine assumed the man at the top would see the whole picture and direct the response. Their doctrine, such as it was, assumed the man at the top would probably lose contact with the men at the bottom, and that the men at the bottom would figure it out anyway. This is not the comfortable version of Midway. The comfortable version says the Americans had better intelligence, better luck, and a few minutes of good timing. All of that is true but insufficient. What the Americans had, the thing that turned those chaotic, uncoordinated, individually suicidal attacks into a victory that changed the course of the Pacific War, was something that could not be trained, could not be drilled, and could not be ordered from above. It was a culture that had taught its young men, long before they ever climbed into a cockpit, that when the plan fails, you do not wait for a new plan. You become the plan. Nagumo survived Midway. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara and continued to serve. He commanded carrier forces at the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz Islands, but the weapon he had wielded, the concentrated carrier striking force that was supposed to win Japan's war in a single blow, never recovered. Japan lost not only 4 fleet carriers at Midway, but over 700 aircraft mechanics, maintenance specialists, and flight deck handlers, the trained technicians who kept the planes flying, a loss that would prove even harder to replace than the pilots or the ships. This is a point that modern historians have emphasized and that popular accounts tend to miss. The roughly 110 aircrew killed at Midway, while a serious loss, represented approximately 1/4 of the carrier-based pilots who sailed with the Kido Butai. The Japanese still had enough pilots to rebuild. What they could not replace was the institutional knowledge that went down with the ships, the mechanics who could tune an engine by sound, the ordnance handlers who could arm a torpedo in the dark, the flight deck directors who could land aircraft in rough seas. These men had taken years to train, and the Japanese training system had no capacity to produce them quickly. The factories in Japan could eventually build new carriers. The shipyards could lay new keels. But the human infrastructure, the thousands of hours of accumulated experience stored in the hands and heads of the men who worked below the flight deck, was gone in an afternoon and would never come back. Worse still, Japan's carrier aviation had been built around a small, elite pilot corps. Japanese flight training was long, rigorous, and produced superb individual aviators, but it produced very few of them. The American system, by contrast, was designed for mass production. American flight training was shorter, less polished, and turned out pilots who were, individually, less skilled, but it turned out thousands of them. By 1943, the American training pipeline was producing more carrier-qualified pilots per month than Japan had lost at Midway in total. The mathematics of attrition had shifted permanently. Nagumo was given command of the defense of Saipan in 1944. When the island fell to the American Marines in July, he died by his own hand on July 6, 1944. He was posthumously promoted to Admiral. Dick Best, the pilot who put a bomb into Akagi and then helped sink Hiryu that same afternoon, never flew in combat again. His faulty oxygen canister had been contaminated with caustic soda. The fumes destroyed his lungs and activated latent tuberculosis. He spent 32 months in the hospital and was medically retired as a lieutenant commander in 1944. He went on to work as an analyst at the Rand Corporation. He died on October 28, 2001, at the age of 91. He always said Midway was revenge, sweet revenge for Pearl Harbor. Wade McCluskey, the air group commander who followed the destroyer's wake, returned to the Enterprise that morning with his aircraft riddled with over 50 bullet holes and a wound through his shoulder. Admiral Nimitz later said that McCluskey's decision to continue the search and his judgment as to where the enemy might be found decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. McCluskey retired as a captain in 1956 and was advanced to Rear Admiral on the retired list, a so-called tombstone promotion awarded for his Navy Cross. He died in 1976. George Gay, the sole carrier-based survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued from the ocean the following day by a Navy patrol plane. He served for the rest of the war and later became a commercial pilot. He told his story publicly for decades, though historians have noted that some details in his later accounts differ from his earliest statements to the Navy. He died in 1994 at 77. John Waldron's body was never recovered. His widow Adelaide received his Navy Cross. The torpedo squadron he led into annihilation scored no hits and inflicted no direct damage, but the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and of Torpedo Squadrons 6 and 3 behind them drew the Japanese fighter cover to sea level at the precise moment the dive bombers needed the sky to be empty. They did not live to see the result of what they had done. None of them knew, in those final minutes, that their deaths would matter. Dusty Kleiss, the young pilot from Coffeyville, Kansas, who scored hits on both Kaga and Hiryu, and later hit the cruiser Mikuma, was one of only 2 pilots at Midway to hit multiple ships. He lived to be 100 years old and published a memoir titled Never Call Me a Hero. He died in 2016, widely described as the last surviving American dive bomber pilot from the Midway attack. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lie on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 17,000 feet below the surface. In 2019, a deep-sea research expedition led by the late Paul Allen's team located the wreck of Kaga. The ship was found resting upright on the ocean floor, largely intact, in total darkness, 3 miles down. Nagumo's question, the one the officers on the bridge of Nagara heard him ask quietly that night, was the right one. How did they know we were coming? He was asking about the codebreakers, but he could have been asking a bigger question. He could have been asking how a force that was smaller, less trained, flying inferior machines, carrying defective weapons, launching from fewer carriers, and attacking without coordination, had managed to destroy in a single morning the fleet that had conquered the Pacific. The answer is that the men who flew those planes were not executing a doctrine. They were not following a system. They were not waiting for orders. They were making decisions, one at a time, in the cockpit, on the water, in the dive, in the moment, each man weighing what he could see against what he knew and acting on it without asking anyone's permission. Waldron turned left when Ring turned right. McCluskey kept flying when Fuel said turn back. Best pulled out of his dive and picked a new target in mid-air. Gay pressed his torpedo run with his gunner dead behind him and 5 fighters on his tail. Each of those decisions was made alone. None of them were made according to plan. All of them, together, produced a result that no plan could have designed. The Admiral was saluting his pilots at dawn because he believed the sky belonged to him. It did. For 6 months it had. But on June 4, 1942, the sky met something the Admiral's system had no category for. It met men who did not need a system to tell them what to do. And by the time the sun set on the Pacific that evening, with 4 carriers burning on the horizon and 3,000 men sliding into the deep, the sky had chosen its answer. It did not belong to the man who planned the battle. It belonged to the men who refused to stop fighting after the plan had failed. If this investigation gave you something, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this. Stories about ordinary men in extraordinary machines who decided, in one moment, that the situation required something and that the someone was going to have to be them. They had names. They came from somewhere. They deserved to be remembered, not for how they were ordered to fight, but for what they chose to do when the orders stopped coming.